There's one simple technique when you go to transplant your tomatoes in the ground that can make all the difference in your harvest. It can determine how healthy your plant is throughout the growing season and ultimately how many tomatoes you wind up with. I'm going to share what that technique is with you today, and we're also going to talk through some basic tomato care tips and tricks and things you need to know to keep your tomato plants healthy all season long. So let's dive into it. So here I've got a tomato that I bought from the nursery. Now I actually have some tomatoes started by seeds in most of my beds. They have not germinated yet, but I'm a little late in my area to begin growing tomatoes by seed. It'll probably still work, but to get a jump on the season, what I did was I went to the big box store and I just got me a nursery tomato. So today I wanted to show you how we could successfully plant a tomato in the ground. So whether you've started your own tomato by seed and been growing it indoors, or whether you've gotten a nursery plant that you want to put into the ground, this will work either way. The very first thing I did was I took this tomato and I let it sit out in my garden overnight. So I bought it yesterday and it sat out overnight in the garden, just kind of getting acclimated to the area that I'm going to put it in. Kind of my way of like a quick hardening off process, if you will. If you had started your seeds indoors, however, because this one's been outside, it's acclimated to the elements. I just wanted to get it acclimated to the space. But if you started your seeds indoors, you're gonna need to harden them off for about 7 to 10 days before you plant them in the ground. I have other videos talking about exactly how to do this. But basically it's getting them acclimated to the outside environment before you put them in the ground to avoid shock to your plants. So definitely make sure you don't skip that step. But because I bought this tomato and I'm going to be planting it in the ground, I want to show you what that process looks like and how we can do it well. The first thing I want to talk about is the soil quality. Now, it's really important, especially when it comes to tomatoes, all plants really, but tomatoes especially because they're heavy feeders, that you have a very good soil. You're going to want something that's rich in organic matter, like compost. You're going to want something that's well draining. Tomatoes don't like to sit in water. And you want something that has some water holding properties. My native soil here is sand. It would never hold enough water for tomatoes. I've successfully grown tomatoes before in very sandy soil, but what I had to do was constantly water. I mean, sometimes multiple times a day. You don't want to fight that all year long. So the best thing you can do is make sure that you have the right type of soil to grow your tomatoes. Like I said, they're heavy feeders. So I always add fertilizer to my soil. Now, some people will say just compost is good enough. And maybe that's true. I've just found that my tomato plants really benefit from a little boost of fertilizer. So when I prepared this space, I put organic granular fertilizer in it and I mixed it in. If you hadn't done that, let's say that maybe your space isn't very well prepared. Maybe you don't feel like you have enough organic matter. Maybe you don't feel like you have enough compost in that space. Maybe you haven't added any fertilizer to your beds. What you could do is add organic granular fertilizer or any type of fertilizer. I just prefer organic, but add that fertilizer in to the planting hole when you get ready to plant your tomatoes. It will break down over time. You could water it in with a water-soluble fertilizer. I will be giving this tomato plant the occasional drink of water-soluble fertilizer throughout the growing season. I'm not going to do that right now because I feel like this space is very well prepared. And based off of the way the plant looks, it looks pretty green and pretty healthy. I'm also not going to add fertilizer right now because I don't want it to begin growing yet. I actually want the roots to get established in this space before we try to promote more heavy green growth, which is what a boost of nitrogen would promote. So because of that, I'm going to hold off on the water-soluble fertilizer today, but I will start giving it to it probably every couple of weeks. Because I bought this from a nursery, I also know that it's had water-soluble fertilizer. It's been growing with water-soluble fertilizer. So I don't want to just take that away. because it could put the plant into shock, or it could be detrimental to the plant. So we talked about the soil quality that you need. The next thing we want to talk about is making sure that the space that you have gets enough sun. Ideally, you would have already prepared your bed ahead of time and you've determined that it gets ideally 6 hours of sun. But that's going to be really important. Make sure that whatever space you are planting your tomato in, it gets a minimum of 6 hours of sunlight. For your tomato plants, you're going to need to provide some type of support. Now, this support is going to be dependent on what type of plant you're growing. If you're growing a determinate variety, that's a smaller tomato plant. It'll get to a determined height. It's going to set all of its fruit at once, and then it's going to begin to die off. Now, I really like determinate varieties just because with those you can use something like a tomato cage for most of them. You provide a little bit of support, but they don't grow 8 feet tall like some of your indeterminate varieties can do. So because of that, I really like determinate varieties. The thing about that is a determinate variety is not going to produce all season long the same way an indeterminate variety would do. So because of this, a lot of people will actually prefer the indeterminate varieties. You're also usually not going to get the big slicers on determinate varieties that you can get on the indeterminate varieties, so something to keep in mind. Indeterminate just means that it will continue to grow all season long unless a frost or disease or pest comes along and wipes it out. The indeterminate varieties can get quite tall if they are allowed to go single stem up a stake. The natural growth habit of the indeterminate variety, however, usually they're going to be naturally on the ground and the vines will just ramble along. So we can save space in our garden by growing those up a trellis or a stake. I'm using a trellis this year. In the past, I've done single stem pruning or double stem pruning up an 8-foot post. I found that worked really well. I'm actually going to be using the trellis system this year just because I want to avoid sun scald because I'm in Florida and I had a big issue with sun scald last year in North Carolina. So I'm going to try trellising this year and I'm going to see if that works better. I also don't want to prune as heavy. Single stem, double stem pruning requires a lot of work. You have to constantly be checking for suckers and pruning your plants. I don't want to fight that this year, and because of that, I'm going to use this trellis. Now, I'm still going to have to prune. That brings me to our next point. You're going to have to prune your tomato plant if you want to get the best harvest possible. You're going to start with pruning off before transplanting even. We're going to prune these lower leaves right here. I'm going to show you guys that in a minute, but you're going to keep a decent space between the first set of leaves and the soil surface of your tomato plant. You're going to take off those lower leaves to promote airflow and help prevent against diseases. In this video, I'm going to show you exactly what to prune, but throughout the growing season, you're going to have to prune off what we call suckers. Now, you can leave a few of them. The more you leave, the more fruit you could get. However, the smaller that fruit is going to be, and the more chance there is for pest, disease, and things like that. And it's just going to be an environment that promotes those pest and disease issues. So because of that, we do want to do some pruning. How heavy you do or how light you do is going to be a preference. And I would say pay attention to your garden, pay attention to how your tomato plants are doing, and adjust your pruning according to your own needs. So with this tomato plant, it's already started to get some good growth on it, even in my container. I'm actually a little worried about the roots being bound, but we'll look at those as we take it out. However, I want to talk about pruning and the pruning technique right now. Here's your main stem, and here's your branch that comes off of that. We want to keep this branch, and we want to keep the main stem. But we do not want to keep this right here. Whenever you see a stem coming out of the elbow or the joint of your main stem and a branch, what we call that is a sucker. Now, if we allow this to grow, it will actually produce an entire tomato plant all by itself. We could actually take this sucker off. Well, we could let it get a little bit bigger first. Take this sucker off, it would produce its own roots. By putting it in a cup of water or something like that for a couple of days, it would produce its own roots. Like I said, it'd have to be a little bit bigger than this, but it would actually produce its own roots, and we could plant that in the ground and get an entirely new tomato plant, which would be awesome. However, we don't have space for that many tomato plants. So because of that, and because we also want to promote a really healthy main stem here, what I'm going to do is just take off these suckers. So I have one here, I have another one down here. I got another one here, and I'm just clipping them off with my fingers. While I'm at it, I'm going to also take off the lower branches. I'm going to leave the top ones here for now, and I'm just going to go ahead and put this in the ground. I don't want to cause too much shock to the plant. I don't want to do too much damage to it while I'm getting those roots established. So we're going to get this transplanted. I'm going to show you how to do it the right way, and I'm going to share that tip with you about how to get the best harvest off your tomato plants and grow the healthiest tomato plants throughout the season just by how you plant. Hopefully you can see here, I have really beautiful compost, really beautiful soil. Once I get down pretty far though, my native soil kind of sucks. So about 12 inches down, my native soil sucks. It's very sandy. That should be about good. So we've got our hole dug here. Oh, and I'll pop the tomato plant out. The best way to do this, this is an early girl tomato, by the way. Those are really good to get a harvest pretty quickly. But the best way to pop this tomato plant out is going to be, I'm going to squeeze the bottom gently. I see some roots poking out here. And I'm going to pull the tomato plant out. Oh yeah, these roots look pretty good. So what I'm going to do is just kind of tease those roots. You can do this with tomatoes. You can't do this with all of your vegetables, but tomatoes, their roots are pretty forgiving and you can tease those out. So I made my hole really deep, and that's what we want. We want a very deep hole to be able to plant our tomato plant in. And that's going to be the trick. So I'm going to take off these bottom leaves here. Take off these bottom leaves, and I'm going to plant this stem really deep. The thing about tomatoes is that the roots will actually grow all the way along the stem. So we can create a much stronger plant, and we can create more of a harvest by encouraging stronger root development. The way that we do that is planting our tomato plants very deeply. I'm going to plant it all the way up this stem. I may have it a little too deep here, but, and again, a good practice would be actually adding fertilizer to the planting hole and kind of mixing it in. Like I said, I'm not doing that just because I know this space is very well fertilized, but that would be something you could do if you're worried about your space not having enough nutrients in it. So we're going to bury this thing really deeply. Notice that I let that root ball go down deeper than the soil surface. Then I'm going to backfill it. Bury it all the way up. And throughout the growing season, I'm going to encourage this little plant to climb up the trellis behind it. What I'll do, I planted it pretty close to the trellis. What I'll do as it begins to grow is I'll just weave it in and out of the trellis, and it will actually start to climb on its own. Tomatoes are really going to benefit from consistent moisture. Most of your plants are going to benefit from consistent moisture. If you think about a tomato, it is actually full of water. It's a very juicy fruit. And so because of that, tomatoes need a lot of water to be able to produce fruit. Something that can happen if there's not consistent moisture in the soil is something called blossom end rot. Now, a lot of people will say this is from a calcium deficiency. That's true technically, like scientifically, what causes blossom end rot is a calcium deficiency in your plants. Your plants aren't able to take up enough calcium from the soil. Most soil, especially if you added compost or any type of amendments to it, probably has enough calcium for your tomato plants. But the problem becomes that the tomato plant can't take up that calcium because there isn't enough water in the soil. This can be true if there's too much water in the soil or if there's not enough water in the soil. Because of this, we want to maintain a very consistent moisture level for your plants. By planting our tomatoes really deeply and encouraging that deep root development, and that healthy root development, we're actually also encouraging it to be able to sustain itself with less watering, because the deeper the roots go, the more water there is actually in the soil already. But one thing you can do is make sure you're adding a balanced fertilizer. I talked about that earlier, but adding a balanced fertilizer throughout the growing life of your plants, especially when it comes to fruit set. You want to kind of hold off. You don't want something with like really high nitrogen when it comes to fruit set. What you're going to care more about is that potassium and phosphorus, specifically the phosphorus. So NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium is what it stands for. But anyway, you're going to want to make sure that you have a balanced fertilizer. This will kind of discourage against blossom end rot, and make sure that you're consistently watering your plants. Another thing you can do, especially if it's getting really hot, is make sure that you're adding mulch. Mulch will help the soil stay a little bit cooler, and it will kind of lock that moisture into place. So something like pine shavings or straw would be a really good option to mulch around your plants. Or you could use crushed up leaves even. You could use grass clippings, but I would make sure that they're not clumped up together. You could have a mess. But something else to really consider and keep in mind is when these plants are going to grow best. Now, tomatoes don't like it to be too cold. They are going to thrive between 70 and 85 degrees daytime temperatures. Nighttime temperatures, they can handle it a little bit colder once they're established, but they don't really do that great in 50-degree weather. So they're not going to want to set fruit if the temperatures are 50 degrees or lower, consistently staying 50 degrees or lower at night. Tomatoes aren't going to do very well when temperatures get too high either. So temperatures above 90 degrees, you're probably not going to have fruit setting. This can be especially troublesome in the middle of the summer because, like where I live, my struggle in growing tomatoes is not that it gets too cold, it's that it gets too hot. So in the middle of summer here in Florida, I may not see fruit set in July, August, maybe even September, maybe even up into June. I don't know. I haven't grown here yet. We're going to find out. But that's one of the reasons why I went ahead and got a plant start from the store, because right now it is February. And believe it or not, I should actually have tomatoes already growing, tomatoes already in the ground, if I want to get a harvest before it gets too hot. So those are just some things to keep in mind when it comes to your tomatoes and caring for your tomatoes throughout the growing season. Plant deeply, encourage that strong root development, make sure your soil is well draining, full of organic matter. Make sure your tomato plant gets plenty of sun, at least 6 hours a day. Give it if you're growing an indeterminate variety, give it a trellis or give it a stake of some kind. If you're growing a determinate variety, a cage will probably work. Make sure that you're watering consistently, add mulch if needed, and prune for better airflow. You're going to have a very healthy tomato plant all throughout the growing season. Another thing to watch out for when it comes to your tomato plants is pests. So tomatoes can deal with things like aphids. That's a really common problem. They can also deal with things like a tomato hornworm. A tomato hornworm will devastate your tomato plants in a very short period of time. So I like organic pest management options, and I don't use a lot of, even the organic pest management options, I don't use a lot of things on my plants just because I don't want to kill the beneficial bugs that are out here, and I don't want to disrupt the ecosystem that's being built. So one good way that I have found to mitigate pests is to make sure that my plants are really healthy. So planting them the right way, taking good care of them, keeping that consistent moisture, reducing the lower leaves, pruning for airflow. All of those things are going to go a long way in reducing pests. But pests are still going to find their way into your garden, and there's going to be those occasions where you have to make a decision about using something on your plant or losing your plant because the pests are just out of control. What I have found is neem oil is a great option, especially when it comes to aphids and mites and things like that. I will use that again sparingly. I will use it at night or in the evening time on my tomato plants if they need it. I'm not going to use this as a preventative measure. Some people do, and I'm not saying that that's wrong. This is just my experience. This is what I found. I use neem oil as a when I need it measure, not a preventative measure. The other option is BT. BT is going to be good for caterpillars, so it works on the tomato hornworm. And again, tomato hornworms can devastate your garden in a very short period of time. I'm going to keep an eye on the foliage of the plants, and if I notice that the leaves are being eaten or the plants start to look really bare, I'm going to use that BT, because more than likely I'm dealing with a tomato hornworm. Tomato hornworms, you can pick them off. They're really hard to see. So you kind of have to go outside with a black light at night to get your tomato hornworms off your plants. They blend in. But I found a really good option, honestly, for me to save time is using that BT. If I notice that the foliage is being eaten, I'm going to spray it down with a heavy dose of BT. Again, keep in mind that this could kill off your beneficial bugs. BT not so much, because it's targeted really toward that caterpillar family, but either way, anything you spray on your garden, it's not going to discriminate against bad bugs and good bugs. It's going to kill all the bugs. So just be mindful of that. A lot of people will use pesticides to keep their tomato plants looking healthy and make sure they get a harvest. That's something you can look into and do. I typically don't go that route. Like I said, I stick with organic methods. But there are a ton of options out there to help you deal with pests. Another option is netting. Now, I would say that might work when your tomato plants are small, if you're worried about them being taken out. But once they get bigger, you're going to have to remove that netting, because it's just not practical. I hope this video was helpful for you. I hope you got some value out of it. I hope it answered some of your questions about planting tomatoes. And I hope you're growing tomatoes in your garden this year. Leave me a comment down below. Let me know what your favorite variety of tomato is, and let me know how you're planting it. Are you trellising it? Are you staking it? Are you doing the single stem pruning or the double stem pruning? Or are you letting it go wild? Let me know down in the comments. I'm going to leave a video on your screen until the next video comes out. Thank you guys so much for watching. May your garden be filled with grace, and may you be abundantly blessed. We'll see you next time. Bye.